Hi, welcome to lecture 2 of week 2, part 1 of 2. In this lecture we're going to cover, or in this lesson we're going to cover section 2.4 from the book, the first few sections. So the basic idea behind this lesson is to provide us some tools to be able to talk about the system SL that we've been talking about. So there's a few distinctions that we need to make in order to be able to do this. And one of those is the distinction between mention versus use. So ordinarily, when we're talking in English, we're using the words to express things. So when I say, John has a puppy, I'm using the word John as a name and saying of John, of the person, that he has a puppy. But you can also just mention words. So if you want to just, rather than using a word, you want to say something about the word itself, you want to mention it. So often you might see people, use quote marks. And one way you might use the quote marks when you do it with your fingers is to use it as scare quotes, right? So you say, don't take this too literally, and I'm going to put scare quotes in it. But there's also a use of quote marks to just say, okay, I'm talking about the particular word. So the way we do that here is by using a single quote mark, and we say, John has 4 letters. Here, we're not actually using the word John. We're just mentioning it. And the reason why we want to mention it is because we actually want to say something about the word John. We don't want to actually use it. So when we say the word John has 4 letters, this sentence ends up being true. But if we were not to put quote marks around it, so if we just said John has 4 letters, this sentence would in fact actually be false, because John is a person. He isn't the kind of thing that is made out of letters that we could count them. So this sentence is false. Because John isn't the kind of thing that can be made out of letters. But this sentence is true. Because the word John, and notice that I have to put quotes around it again, right? Because I'm not saying because the word John, because John, the person, is not a word. So I need to put quote marks around it when I mean the actual word. So I can say this sentence is true because the word John has 4 letters. Okay, so, and let me do one more example then. Notice the difference between the 2 commands. You should study logic, and you should study logic. The object of study for this first sentence is logic, like the principles that we've been talking about. The second one, when it says you should study logic, with the quote marks around it, that means you should study this word, right? So this is a command to study the word logic, i.e. the letters that make it up. Or you might also say like the history of it, for example. But you're studying the word there. You're not studying the thing that the word is referring to. But here, when we say you should study logic, this is a command to study the principles of reasoning. Okay, so the reason why we need this distinction is because we want to sometimes talk about our system SL, the language that we have. So sometimes we want to talk about our symbolic language. And SL is the name of that language. So if we want to talk about that language, then what we're doing is we're not actually saying, we're not in the language using it to refer to other things, but we're using English to talk about another language. So let's go over an example. So if you're learning French, for example, you often talk about the French language. Talk about the French language. So in this case, French is what we call your object language. Right? So in the same way as we can talk about objects in the world, we can have languages themselves be these objects of study. Right? So maybe not an object in the physical sense, but an object in the sense of that's something we're talking about. And the language that you use to talk about the object language is called the meta language. If you're using English to talk about French, then English is what we're going to call the meta language. So in our case, the symbolic language SL, that's our object language. So we often want to say things about that language. And English is our meta language. So that's the language we're going to use to talk about SL. Okay, so let's go over a few examples then. So in SL, the following is a sentence. So this is how I should write it. Sorry, we'll say this. The symbols A and B form a sentence. Jeez, there we go. Sentence in SL. So notice here that I'm using quote marks to say that the following symbols, and now I'm referring to the symbols. Right? So I'm not using the symbols here, I'm mentioning them. And I'm saying everything in the quote marks here that I'm mentioning, this is a sentence in SL, and it's a particular sentence in SL. And the meta language here is English, right? So this language outside here, this is in English. This is our meta language, and we're using our meta language to say something about the object language, which is the thing that's in the quote marks here, the symbol A and B. And this sentence, this meta-linguistic sentence, is true, right? So it's saying something true about the object language, namely that this expression here is in fact a sentence in symbolic logic, whereas the symbols A, B, C, and form a sentence. This sentence is false, right? So the meta-linguistic sentence here meta-linguistic sentence is false here. And the reason why is because it's saying something about SL, and what it's saying about it is in fact not the case. So it's false. Okay, and then one other thing then, one other tool that we're going to use. These are called metavariables. So sometimes, in this case here, we're talking about a very specific sentence in SL. But sometimes we want to talk about all sorts of sentences. So we can say, we don't want to talk about particular sentences, but we want to talk about sentences in SL in general. So there what we're going to use is boldface to indicate a metavariable. And hopefully you've guessed correctly that the reason why we call them metavariables and not just variables is because a metavariable is a variable that's in our meta language, not in our object language. So we could, for example, have variables in our object language. So if you do mathematics, you'll realize that x is a classical variable that you use in your object language. when you're doing mathematics. But if we want to talk about certain kinds of functions, for example, or in our case, if we want to talk about sentences in our language SL, then we can use what's called a metavariable, right? So a variable that's in our meta language that you can replace, or the value of that metavariable is going to be any arbitrary sentence in SL. So, for example, we will say if, and we'll use boldface here, if P, I need to unbold this, there we go. If P is a sentence in SL, then so is not, oh, I need to boldface that again, there we go. Then so is not P. So here, what you can do is, P here is, I pointed to the screen, P here is a metavariable. So you can replace this with any sentence of SL. In particular, you could replace P, boldface P here, the metavariable, with this particular sentence in our object language, A and B. Okay, so these are some other tools that we'll make use of later on. If you have any questions or if there's something unclear, please make sure to comment.